this session which is motivated by the fact that there are a large economic gaps on the basis of gender. Okay? Here are some examples of these economic gaps. This is a graph of women's labor force participation. It's a cross-country graph. One of the things you will notice is this is India here, this big round thing is India here. And women's labor force participation in India is 2015 data, quite recent, is 30%. Okay? You notice, of course, it's among one of the lowest numbers on this entire global graph. So this is a very pathetic number. That means only 30% of women are engaged in the labor force. Okay? So that's a big disparity. More than 90% of men are engaged in the labor force, and so this is a very, very large gender gap here. So India is not the only country which suffers from this gap in labor force participation. They're, keeping us company are many countries. At the bottom there, below 40%. Okay, so it means that a lot of women are not engaged in activities that are counted towards economic growth. Okay, now that can be interpreted in two ways. One is that the system of national accounts is very unfair and not valuing the contributions made by women, for instance, in household work or child care or caring for family members and elders and so on. That is, I think, is a correct thing. We have unfortunately not yet found a standardized way to adjust for these things and to value this work that women are doing. Okay? It so happens that part of the reason we don't know how to value this work well is it's not paid in the market, right? These are intra-household transactions, and GDP and measures like that count only market transactions. I think that matters. It says something about society as it is structured, that these activities are not valued, but I think that plays out in the kind of value society assigns to women as well. So one way I think we can be more pro-woman is to change our entire system of GDP accounts, but we haven't gotten there yet. So these are basically, you should think of this as, it's not that women are not doing anything, they're not engaging in paid market work, right? That's the way to think about this. But that can have severe implications for their economic independence and agency and other types of life choices. Okay? The second interesting thing about this graph is you can see very nicely on the x-axis is GDP per capita, y-axis is women's labor force participation. You can see a very U-shaped relationship. Okay? It is not a monotonic relationship with GDP per capita. In fact, the highest women's labor force participation is seen in the very poorest countries, right, where 80% of the women are engaged in the labor force. So it's something slightly interesting. So it's, do you have a question or no? Yeah. So you can see it's a U-shaped relationship, and this is, it's a standard cross-country graph. So this doesn't automatically mean that as a country grows richer, women's labor force participation will first decrease then increase. That is not what it means. It just says this is how the world looks like now. It could be that, when Burundi attains middle income status, they're still at 80% women's labor force participation. I do not know, because they have not reached there and they're not going to do it for a long time. So, but it's an interesting relationship you do see in the data. Okay? When it comes to time series, I'll talk about India at the very end. It is a fact that in India, we have had significant economic growth for the last 25, 30 years, and women's labor force participation has barely moved. If anything, it has declined a little bit. So maybe we are still on this downward part of the graph, but I don't know. It's not obvious that we will ever reach the upward part. So anyway, that's just to show that this is a U-shaped relationship, and India is among the lowest. So even for its GDP per capita level, it's well below. Suppose you fit a quadratic curve to this line, India is well below that line. Okay? All right. This is another dimension of the economic gender gap. This is a graph of the gender wage gap in high-income countries. Why high-income countries? Because we have good data for those countries, so it's easier to make this graph. But also, these are countries with generally pretty high levels of women's labor force participation. So there's one gap where women are not engaging in paid market work, but even when they engage in such activities, they are not compensated as well as men. So that is another unfortunate fact. You can see that in most of these high-income countries, the gender wage gaps have come down considerably over time. So if you look at the United States, which is that blue line, the gender wage gap in the 70s was about 40%. So women were paid 40% less than men, while if you come to the most recent period, women are paid 20% less than men. So it's still sizable, but at least it has gone down over time. That said, the lowest you can find is Italy, which has a gender wage gap of about 5%, which is not very much, but you still have very advanced countries like Japan, which are having like a 25% wage gap. Okay? So these are just some, obvious facts that there is a large economic gender gap. Okay? Does this matter? How much does this matter? So this is a recent McKinsey report. Now I don't know how well they estimate these things, but they come up with this really huge number. Okay? So they say that, well, so they make the simulation. Suppose all countries match the best performance of the fastest improving country in their region. So it's not like they're saying that India should become the United States, right? They're just comparing within region. If you reach levels of gender parity compared to the best in your region, that itself could add something like $12 trillion to annual GDP, okay, of the globe. Now you may or may not believe this estimate. 12 trillion is a huge number, but even if you take half of that, right? Even if you take 6 trillion is also a very large number. Okay, so it could be that humanity as a whole is leaving a lot of money or unrealized potential on the table, or not valuing such potential to its fullest extent by not having gender parity. Okay? Yes.
And like if we take wage gap as a proxy for gender parity, so if like wage gap is continuously falling, we say that it's because perception of it is changing. So back in the previous slide, you showed us the graph. So like for these countries continuously falling, so we can say the perception of these countries is changing. But like for these countries where there are different spikes, so what do we do?
Yeah, why does it's not very straight, right? So there's noise in the data. Some of it could be business cycle effects, right? Some of it that in certain years, certain industries grow more than others, and maybe in some years, more male-dominated industries grow faster, and so you have a little. You see what I mean? The year-to-year changes could be just those kind of things. Yeah, we can adjust it. It will be lower, but it's not that much lower. It still exists. It doesn't go away. That part you can very clearly say. So we can find the unadjusted one, but it's still there. It's not that the adjusted is 0. Okay? And this is all again conditional on labor force participation in the first place too. So we have to remember that there's a huge gap before this number even becomes relevant. Okay? All right. This is just a sample number to say that we may be leaving a lot of potential unrealized economically by not having gender parity. The other thing you can also notice, there is a very large gender gap in leadership roles. These are aggregate numbers, but when you look at the top of many professions, it is quite striking to see very few women. And this happens at the top of many professions. You look at political representation, only about 25% of all national parliaments are composed of women right now. And this is including countries with gender quotas. Okay? So this is, so in one sense you could say if there were no gender quotas, this number would be even lower than 25%. You look at business, I just looked up the Fortune 500 companies. There are, out of the 500 companies, there are 25 women CEOs. Okay? So this is a very pathetic representation, so to speak. We in the economics profession are equally guilty, so to speak. So less than 15% of full professors of economics in the United States are women. Now, I don't know whether there are comparable numbers for other countries, including India. I haven't seen those numbers. In the United States, the American Economic Association is now gathering this data annually as a first step to at least figure out what the data looks like. And this is not a very pretty picture. What have countries tried to do is also, this is not the first time these numbers are there, and it's not that people are unaware of these things. Many countries are trying many different versions of trying to bring gender parity in some of these things. So Japan, for instance, famously has adopted a womenomics policy, or so the Prime Minister claims. He's trying to encourage firms to hire more women. He's trying to provide more childcare centers. He's trying to tell firms that not only you should hire more women at the entry level, but more of your directors should be women. The fraction of women is slowly going up. It's not like you can see very huge dramatic changes yet. What a lot of countries have done are political gender quotas have caught on as a very popular policy ideas. So at last count, more than 100 countries, which I was surprised, like more than 100 countries have some form of political gender quota. So this seems to be a really popular type of policy. And some countries have also put quotas on membership of corporate boards and board of directors and things like that. And the question is, how well do these work? You know, what impact do these quotas have? It's widely used, very popular. I think politicians like to give themselves pats on the back to say, look, we've put in this quota, we are so women friendly. So we'll review some of the evidence, at least from India, on how well these political quotas work and what they might work for. And then think a little bit about what are the barriers that may be restricting women's full-fledged economic participation. You can think of a long list of things. And please join the discussion. As I said, I know some of you are already working on these topics, so it will be great to hear. I'll show you some recent papers I came across on the impact of social norms on these kind of gender-specific outcomes. That's one possible thing which may be holding back and relates to our previous session's discussion on culture and conventions and so on. All right, so that's what I'm going to talk about. So let's talk a little bit about the evidence on quotas. First, I just want to discuss briefly a conceptual basis when thinking about political gender quotas, right? So political gender quotas in most cases means that you are finding some way to have a woman leader instead of a man, okay? And this could be like in India through reservations. You tell people you can only elect a woman in certain constituencies. It can be by increasing the number of women candidates. So many countries have what is called a candidate quota. So Indonesia, which is the third largest democracy in the world, has a rule that every 1/3 of all the candidates put forward by every political party have to be women. Okay, so that's a kind of candidate quota. There are many versions of this. But first, I want you to think about a little bit of the political economy setting. If people have seen this model, this is a very standard model of Downsian political competition, which makes a formal assumptions. It says, well, if voters have sort of single peaked preferences, that means they have a preferred policy and well-behaved preferences on either side of that policy. And if there are only two candidates who are interested in winning the election, each candidate proposes a policy. Voters vote sincerely for the candidate whose policy proposal is closest to their ideal point. And the winning candidate, of course, implements what he or she promised. This is a fairly simple setting, but it generates a very strong prediction. It says that both candidates will propose the policy preferred by the median voter. So for people who might have seen this before, this is, of course, very famous median voter theorem or median voter model. But it has the strong implication that the identity or the preferences of the elected representative does not matter for what final policy will be chosen. So if you believe in the setting of the median voter model, gender quotas are completely useless, okay? Because the identity of the elected representative doesn't matter. What matters is the identity of the median voter. And so your focus should be on increasing the fraction of women voting so that the identity of the median voter changes. So this is completely the opposite of what gender quotas do. They're not focusing on the voter, they're focusing on who's elected. So then what I'm saying is when you're thinking about quotas, the first thing to think about is a little bit conceptually, when will these quotas make any difference? You cannot have one of these assumptions has to change, because if you have these settings, this is going to make absolutely no difference. So let's think about when will quotas might make a difference. This is a variation of the median voter model, which is often called the citizen candidate model. Why am I going through this? Because when you're looking, I'm going to discuss the Chattopadhyay and Duflo paper on the India Panchayati Raj reservations, and this is a conceptual model they have in mind. They have to have some, as I said, a variation on the theme. They cannot have the median voter model. So the way they extend the median voter model is that candidates actually care about which policy is chosen, that candidates have policy preferences. And look at number 4, when they are elected, they will implement their preferred policy, not the preferred policy of the median voter. Okay? So you have to have some sort of dimension for the elected representative to exercise his or her own preferences. Their preferences have to matter. And so they say, well, candidates will implement their most preferred policy, not the policy of the median voter. And so then it matters about who becomes a candidate and who will win. Okay, so in the earlier version of the median voter model, 2 candidates are exogenously given. And since their policy preferences don't matter, who cares what they care about? Here, who becomes a candidate is endogenous, so it's a more rich model. And voters are also allowed to vote strategically. So it's not that the voters vote mechanically. This person has proposed a policy which is closest to my ideal point. I just vote for that person. I also take into account what other people will vote for and whether I'm going to waste my votes on a person who's never going to win, and those kind of strategic considerations. So it's, as I said, overall a much richer model. So the big questions becomes who becomes a candidate under this model and who will win. Okay? So if you look at the Chattopadhyay and Duflo paper, they work through a version of this model. And what are the main insights which this model generates? So I'm not going to do the math of the model. That will take a long time, but you can definitely go through in the paper. So one of the implications of this citizen candidate model is that if the cost of candidacy is higher for women than for men, if there is a significantly higher candidacy, cost of candidacy, then no women will enter the race in equilibrium. There will be no women candidates. Okay? So in other words, you can have a situation, and this does not have to be women, it can be any types of candidates with different costs of entering the election. So it just means that you can have a situation where certain types of candidates do not enter the election, even if they are fully enfranchised as voters. So they may be fully enfranchised as voters, they may be fully participating as voters, and yet they never enter as candidates, which means in this setting that their preferences do not get reflected in policy. So this is what we mean by substantive underrepresentation. They do not get a voice in what policies are chosen. And this could be women, it could be lower caste, it could be members of specific tribes or religions or other types of groups, any group which has a higher cost of becoming a candidate for whatever reason. In this particular model, if the cost of entering the election is very, very high, then even a reservation may not be enough to generate women candidates. Even if you tell people that this seat is reserved for women and only women can compete, if the cost of candidacy is very high, you will have no women candidates. In fact, it happens in Indian Panchayat elections. There are seats where nobody enters, even though it's a reserved seat, there are no candidates. And so then many times the State Election Commission have to redo the election and say, okay, we're going to do it again because nobody came. Or sometimes they have 3 candidates enter and then all of them withdraw for various reasons, and then, so there is, it's not a theoretical possibility only, we do see that happening in practice. Okay, yeah. No, they redo the election. They do not violate, they do not make men the sarpanch. So sometimes when the election results are declared, many times they'll be incomplete and they'll say, okay, next month we're going to redo it and make sure that seats are filled. But you have this, I realized this, I'm like, because I was telling my RA, why are all these gaps in the data, why is this not complete? It's like, nahi, wo madam, wo election hua nahi. So this happens. So the more substantive implications of this model are that, of course, if the cost of, yes. Sorry? We'll come to the contest in a minute. This is just the theory right now. So hold on. Hold on for a couple more slides. Yeah, did you have a question? No. So in this model, it's just the 2 types of people. You label them M and W. So in the model, it's very easy. So we'll come to the actual empirical setting in a minute. So what does this model also say? This model says that if women do become candidates as a result of this reservation policy, right, then the overall utility of women will improve because the policy which will be chosen will be closer to women's ideal points. Okay, so you have to start with the one of the basic premises which I should have mentioned before. You have to start with the premise that women have different preferences than men, at least on some dimensions, otherwise what difference would it make anyway? Okay, so they're saying, well, if you have this different cost of candidacy and the women do compete because of reservations, right? Because when you have reservation, you know that your chance of winning is higher because your competition is lower. Then the women's utility will be improved since policy will move closer to what women prefer. But would everyone be better off? That's the part which is ambiguous in this model. So it says, this model also says the reservation may make the median voter better off if nobody would run in the absence of reservation and some bad default policy would be implemented. But the median voter could also be made worse off if the policy chosen under the quotas is very far from his or her ideal point. So it predicts two things. One is that policy choices will change as a result of quotas. Okay? And second, they will change in the direction preferred by women. Now that may or may not be the direction preferred by men, and so it's not clear what will happen to the average voter. All right. So these are the kind of tests this is the model which Chattopadhyay and Duflo take to the data. Obviously they do it in the Indian setting. They're using the Panchayati Raj reforms. So just to review, in India we have the Lok Sabha, where we have 14% women now after the latest election. It is a historic high. So it says something, I think. Anyway, then we have the state legislatures. These are both arenas where there is no gender quota. State legislatures, you can see we put together data for about 3 decades. From 1980 to 2013, there were only about 6% women. So in the absence of quotas, you have very few women in elected office in India. So the Panchayati Raj Quota, as you know, there was a constitutional amendment in 1993 which said that we're going to have a Panchayati Raj, and 1/3 of all the seats have to be reserved for women, both in the panchayats, right, which are at district, block, and village level. So each council is going to have 1/3 women, and 1/3 of all the councils will have women, sarpanch, district council leader, whatever you call them. Okay. The nice thing about India, of course, is that this 1/3 of villages that have to have women, sarpanch or pradhan, are usually chosen randomly by the administration, thus providing a very nice RCT setting for many, many researchers. So, and this is what a lot of researchers have exploited, because then you don't have to worry about identification challenges about why do some places elect women or not. Here, it's chosen randomly. They have to elect a woman. So that's what Chattopadhyay and Duflo do. This is a very classic study, extremely well cited. I do want to go over it because, as I said, a very famous and well cited study. So even if you've seen it before, bear with me. It's a very good study. I went back and reread it. I was even more impressed with the paper when I reread it after some years. So the Chattopadhyay and Duflo study, as I said, very much motivated by the theory. So first, they have data from 2 districts of India. One is in West Bengal and one is in Rajasthan. And they start with the preferences of the voters. So they really, as I said, motivated by the theory. They first survey the preferences of men versus women. And the nice thing is they don't just ask women or men, what do you like or what do you want to happen. It's a little more objective data. They look at what they have complained to the panchayat about. So these are formal sort of complaints raised in Gram Sabha meetings or otherwise by men versus women. So they make a list of all the topics men complain about and all the topics women complain about, and they find that there are differences. So at least the first premise of the model has to be satisfied. They do have different preferences on some dimensions. So for instance, women are much more concerned about drinking water in both the states compared to men. And secondly, women express a lot more concern about roads in West Bengal, but not in Rajasthan. There women and men care equally about roads. So you can see also that these things vary by area. It's not that this is generalized women versus men preferences. Yeah. It could be. It's interesting that I think on schools they don't find actually much differences between men and women. So I think the drinking water is because usually in most parts of India, women are in charge of supplying, making sure that the household has enough water. So obviously if the tap is very far away or the water source is not clean, they are the ones who are going to be complaining about it. So I don't know whether it's so much education as Now again, it would be nice if we could do it in other parts of the country and see whether it systematically relates to education. Right now we have only 2 data points here. Yeah, other questions? Yeah. So that's exactly what they're going to test. Will they implement a different set of policies when they're effect? That is exactly the question of the paper. Right? So in one sense, when you're asking what about women's leadership, here they're basically using the Panchayati Raj rule that you have to have a woman sarpanch in some places instead of a man. Now, it may be that the woman sarpanch is only following the dictates of her husband or other family members, in which case we should find 0 difference between panchayats that have a woman leader and panchayats that have a man. Right? So again, that's another test, another thing the paper is going to test, right? Because we know they have different preferences. The theory says they should then implement different policies. If they don't, then it could be because they don't have independent agency and there's no true woman leader, so to speak. All right. So they're using this rule. So this is, we already mentioned this. 1/3 of the villages are chosen at random and required to have women council heads, and this is quite well implemented in most states in India, including West Bengal where they collect, and Rajasthan where they collected this data. The 1/3 rule is followed quite correctly, and randomization is indeed very random. They have verified that these places are indeed chosen randomly by the administration. So this is what happens. They first check. This is another check of what happens as do you get more women leaders. So you look at the fraction of women pradhans in reserved versus unreserved gram panchayats. And you can see, of course, among the reserved GP, you have 100% women sarpanch. In the unreserved GP, you can see it's super low. Only 6.5% of unreserved GP have women in West Bengal, and 1.7% of women have in Rajasthan. So basically, the reservation does change who becomes the leader. Now, does it change policy? Okay, so this part at least satisfied, because that just means in the absence of this quota, you would not have women leaders. So what happens? So this is their main table. So what do they look at as outcomes? They look at what the panchayat does. Okay, they basically do a survey of all the public goods in each of these villages. Okay, so they literally sent a survey team around to count the number of drinking water facilities that have been newly built or repaired, to see whether the road is in a good condition, to count the number of panchayat runs education centers, irrigation facilities, other public goods, etc. Okay. Why do they do this? You could also do this through budgets, for instance. What does the panchayat spend money on? Unfortunately, many panchayats do not maintain good budgets or any kind of records. If you try to do work in rural India, you know it's really hard. They barely write down anything. So in that sense, it would have this. That part is very hard to get. So this is, at least from the researcher's point of view, it's systematically collected in the same way in all the villages, and so we can compare one village to another. Okay? So they just literally is counting. So it's, in that sense, is a very crude measure of panchayat activity, right? It's not, so for instance, just counting number of education centers. Who knows how well they are actually working? Right? So there's a big gap in all those things, but this is at least a first pass, a very crude measure. So what do they see that? And then, because it's a natural experiment, it's a randomized control trial, they can just compare the unreserved panchayat to the reserved panchayat. Super easy. And what do they find there? You can see that in the reserved GP, there's some, in West Bengal, there's something like 24 newly built drinking water facilities or repaired facilities, while in the unreserved, it's only about 15. Okay? So in the women-headed places, you have a lot more attention being paid to drinking water facilities. They're building new ones or repairing the old ones. You can see the difference is 9. The one in parentheses is standard errors. This is statistically significant difference in the water provision. You see the same thing for Rajasthan. You see that in the reserved areas is 7 drinking water facilities. In the unreserved places, it's 4.7. Again, the difference is statistically significant. Okay? And remember, these were things women valued. Women expressed a strong preference in both the places that for drinking water things, the women leaders actually paying attention to that. The second nice thing they find is you look at roads. This is just a dummy if the road is in a good condition. In West Bengal, you find that the women-headed GPs have more fraction of roads in good condition. In Rajasthan, you find actually no difference. It's not statistically significant. In fact, the men-headed one have a little bit better roads. But again, this is consistent with the previous survey, where only in West Bengal the women expressed a big preference for roads. In Rajasthan, they were the same as men. And so this is a very powerful test of the hypothesis that the policy priorities move in the direction preferred by women. So this proves the first two things. Number one, it does make a difference whether you have a man or a woman. So not all of the women are without agency. At least some of them, we don't know what fraction of them, but at least enough of them are with agency to make some changes to what the panchayat does. And they move in the direction preferred by women. You look at other things, there's not much difference in most of the other irrigation and other sorts of facilities. They don't find a big difference. Okay? So this is first fact of evidence. Yeah. They don't know because they surveyed the complaints before.
No,
So
because if I have a female leader, then it's possible that more women are raising more concerns. So from the demand side also participation is getting better.
yes, so they do find that more women attend the Gram Sabha meetings, for instance, if there's a woman sarpanch. So correct. So it could be that the overall volume of complaint goes more. So that's why they're separating by issue. What do they complain about?
Because this effect may be because the complaints are higher for water facilities, not just that the leader is having this bias.
Yeah, so let me come to the supplementary analysis which they do the complaint, right? Are they responding precisely to the complaints? That's what they test. Hold on. So we're just coming to that in. So what do you mean by investment? This is how they're counting investment. They don't have actual rupees spent because that panchayats don't maintain good records. They're just saying, they go to the village and they say, okay, how many drinking water facilities have been newly made in the new panchayat's term? Yes. So that center does not differentiate between men and women headed GP, right? Reservation is randomly. No, reservation was random. That part it's very well randomized. So whatever center was allocating, of course they usually allocate bigger places have more money and things like that. I mean there are rules, right, about funding. Yeah.
Like transfer of funds from the to the Gram Panchayat usually happens to the state government, and there the political party of the running the panchayat that actually plays a factor, not the gender of the person.
Correct. So it could be totally along party basis. Yeah, here they don't analyze party. It depends. So it varies by state. In some states in India, you cannot officially have a party declared for panchayat elections, even though you may actually have a party affiliation and everybody knows it, but you cannot officially be a candidate of any party in panchayat elections. Some states allow it, but many states say no, no, it's not supposed to be party basis, even though it may be. Correct. Exactly. They almost never do significantly better. And you'll see this, I'll show you a paper from Brazil, which also almost never do the men do better, I'm sorry, but they do better politically, so you'll see. They don't do better in provision of public goods. Yeah, do you have a question? Yeah.
So this is unreserved Grama Panchayats and Indian Pradhans, right?
Yeah.
After the reservation.
Correct, after the reservation. So women can compete in the unreserved. Yeah.
Before, would they provide any information on the proportion of female Pradhans before the reservation? Has the number come down, or what has happened to?
Oh, that they don't know. Yeah. There could be. Actually, some papers have documented that. And we can talk about that when we come to political outcomes in a minute. There has been some work on that. And yeah, this on the ground you do hear these comments. They say, "Aap yahan se kyun khade ho? Why don't you go to the women's seat and become a candidate?" So this is quite a common comment. All right. So one of the things they want to differentiate is exactly something along the lines of what you said. Is why is there more provision of water in women-headed panchayats? Is it that they are responding to the overall voter preferences? or are they responding to the women voters' preference? Is that women now feel more vocal and they complain about the water because there's a woman there, and so the women leaders do more water? Or is it that they're implementing their own preferences regardless of what the complaint was, and their own preference happens to be similar to the preferences of other women in the village? Okay? So they do a very innovative test for these things. So this is why I like, as I said, when I reread the paper, I really liked it even more because they're really going deep into the mechanisms, linking it tightly to a theory, and that is a really contribution. So the way they try to distinguish between these two things is because they have this detailed data on complaints and things. So they run a combined regression for all the public goods put together. Okay? So on the y-axis is a sort of normalized measure of how many public goods you have of each type. You have a dummy for each type of public goods. That's the summation beta L DIL. It's like a dummy for water, dummy for education, dummy for whatever. So you're combining them all into one regression. The main things you have to look at is the coefficient on RJ, which is whether GPJ is reserved, right? This is the overall reservation effect. Then they interact the RJ with this DI. DI is the average difference between the fraction of requests for good I from women and men. So DI is how much more women complain about good I than men. Okay? So do you expect a positive or negative coefficient on this beta 3? Positive? Why positive?
In Rajasthan it would be positive.
Rajasthan it will be positive?
Yes.
Why not? I mean, why not in West Bengal?
Because women have shown their preference to us. A common issue.
Okay, no, so they're combining all the goods together, right? So they're saying for the DI, if DI is greater than 0, that means women complain more about this particular good I, right, than men. So this is the extra level of complaints. In one sense, if women are responding to other women's, the women leaders responding to the women's complaints, you would expect a positive coefficient here, right? Now, how do you distinguish that from her own preferences? Okay, look at the last specification. Look, they run an augmented specification where they put in the main effect of the reservations. They put in this DI times RJ, and they also put in a DIJ times RJ. What is DIJ? This is how much more women complain about that public good in that village. This is overall for the whole state, how much do women complain more than men about good I, and the other one is how much do women complain more about good I than men in my village. So this is in a way, this is sort of testing how much do you respond to the complaints of women in your village, because obviously it's the people in your village who are going to complain to you, not the aggregate of the state. Okay? The SIJ is the total volume of complaints. So this is the sum of the complaints from both men and women. So do you overall respond to more complaints about good I? Okay, which you might do, right? So that's the way they're trying to distinguish. They're saying, well, we'll check how much you respond to complaints within your village versus this generalized preference measure, which is aggregated over the whole state. And what do they find here? So let's just focus over here on column 3. Okay, so they find the whole point. One of two things they find. One is that reserved star DI is a very positive and significant, positive and mostly significant coefficient. This is how much they respond to overall women's extra complaints about good I. Okay, and this is the village level, the reserved times DIJ, and that's a very small and insignificant insignificant coefficient. So they're not responding to complaints of their own village. They're responding to the generalized preference of women. Okay? You find exactly the same thing in Rajasthan. You look at column 8. It's very similar. You find a very large and significant coefficient on the DI times RJ, but not on the DIJ. In fact, the coefficient on the RJ times DIJ is negative. So it's not that they're responding to the complaint specifically. So the channel you said might be working, but that's not what is happening in the data. Women may be complaining more because there is a woman around to listen, but that's not what the woman leader is responding to. Okay? The other thing they do, which, yes?
When you say that they are not responding to complaints from the women of the village, but to the complaints of the women for the whole state, can we say that they are catering to a particular party's agenda?
It could be a party's agenda. It just happens to align with the women versus men difference. right? They're responding, you look at that, to the DI. DI is the overall difference between women and men on this public good. Right? So if a party's agenda happens to also correlate very well with the women versus men difference, then it would be a party agenda. But that we don't know, because as I said, officially you do not know the party affiliation of these people. Yeah. Yeah.
So, have you done this regression in like these two relations separately, like with only DI and
Yes.
DIJ both?
Yeah. So the first one you see, this is first column is with just DI. The third column is with DI and DIJ.
So, where is DIJ in this?
DIJ is, look at this down here. Do I have the thing? So column 3, this one, yeah.
Third one.
So column 3 has the DIJ.
When they have DIJ, they have DI also.
They have DI also, because this is the generalized women versus men difference. This is the women versus men difference in your village.
There's a possibility, means I'm just thinking that they didn't do the regression with DIJ only.
Not with DIJ only, because they're running a horse race between the two.
So there's a
Right?
possibility that this DIJ effect is not being captured in presence of DIA, because these two could be very highly correlated in a state.
There's variation across villages in that state, right?
But
There will be some correlation, of course. That's why they want to put them both together and see which one works better.
But if there's a very high correlation, there's a possibility that you might not get effect of one.
Yeah, if you have very high correlation, usually you see equal and opposite sign coefficients on the two. If you have a real classic multicollinearity problem, you would see sort of very large and opposite sign coefficients on them. You don't see that. You see what I mean? You see a very small and insignificant coefficient here. So you are more likely to get sort of spurious significance if you have high multicollinearity. Yeah, but it is possible. It's a sort of indicative result. They're trying to see which one counts more. Right? Is it the village-specific gender preference or the overall gender preference which is driving the result? And what they're saying is not the village-specific. Okay. Then they look at other things. So obviously, the question is, of course, women leaders are not the same as men. In particular, women leaders in their study are less educated. They are from poorer families, right? They're usually first timers in politics. They have no political experience. So maybe, it's not the effect of gender, it's the effect of some of these other things which we are capturing in the regression, and they want to rule that out. They want to say it's because the gender changes, okay? So the way they do some of these things are very carefully done. They include the controls for the leader characteristics, right? So because they have done their own survey, they've collected the education of the leader, they've collected the income of the leader, and they control for these things. It makes no difference to their main results. Then, of course, the point is whether first-time leaders do perform differently than more experienced ones. So you can see that 89% of the women leaders in their sample had never held any political office before. Right? So they're complete first-timers, and this is where, as you say, the agency might be really low because they have no experience, they don't know what to do. So what they do is a very nice test. They actually compare women leaders to new male leaders. So instead of comparing the women sarpanch to all male sarpanches, they compare it only to first-time male sarpanch. So this is at least a more comparable sample, and they find that the effect of the women leader remains exactly the same. So if you look at this regression, look at this coefficient, they have reserve times di, and then they have a coefficient for pradhan is new and pradhan is new times di. Right? This is interaction with the pradhan is new variable is not significant. So it doesn't matter whether the pradhan is new or not, it doesn't make much difference to the result. It matters whether they're a woman or a man, not whether they're new versus old. Okay? And then, of course, they're looking at things like re-election incentives. In their survey, they asked the women leaders, would you run? So next time, it's quite likely that you will not be reserved. So will you contest for re-election? And 33% of the women leaders said no, compared to only 21% for the men. Right? So maybe there's a difference in political ambition, whether that makes a difference or not. So again, so they compare women leaders to men whose villages would become reserved in the next election. Right? So that both sets of people have low re-election incentives, and again, the effect of the leader gender is the same. So I said the main point is they take a lot of care to say it's gender. It's not really these other characteristics of the women leaders, which of course they're not the same as men in many, many ways. Okay? So main questions, why do these women, so first as I said, they see the difference, they provide different public goods. Why do they do different public goods? The empirical results suggest the main mechanism is women leaders implementing their own preferences, which happen to be similar to other women preferences. It's not that they're responding more to the complaints, so to speak. And as again, as I said, this means that all the women leaders elected under the Panchayati Raj are not token. At least enough of them are non-token, which I think is a very positive result, because this is a very pessimistic narrative about the Panchayati Raj, that what difference does it make? These are women without any independence, and they're just following the dictates of their male family members, and that is not true. At least not all of them are doing it. Okay? So what are the welfare implications? Well, women's preferences are being better represented in the policy decisions, as the model would predict. Does it mean that it's necessarily better? We see different public goods being provided. Are these necessarily the best? We don't know, right? I mean, how do you trade off, one extra drinking water facility versus something else? It's a very hard calculation to make. So we can at least see there's some difference it makes. So I have a similar paper also looking at the Panchayati Raj to think about a different outcome variable. Yeah.
Does that also show that corruption is more among the men members, the Panchayati Raj? Because in most part they were doing, these women reserved candidates were doing better, and rarely we could see that.
Correct, correct. So in one sense you could say that given that it's not that they decline some other public good, then maybe you could say this is actually socially welfare improving, because they provide more water without reducing some other public good. So in that sense it could be said to be welfare improving. Yes.
Like corruption thing, it could be induced by the political inexperience. Once a woman leader is elected more than once
Once she gets enough experience, she knows how to be corrupt. Yes. And we have had, unfortunately, very famous examples of very corrupt women politicians in this country too. I mean, we have shown that we're not behind men in any dimension. So, yeah.
I think it would be very interesting to see the long-term impact after such
Yes.
a period of time whether this impact will remain.
Correct. So that's you. Please go do the survey. No, I'm serious. It's it is important to know the long-run effects. It's we do not have as many long-run effect studies as we should have in economics as a whole. Yeah.
There's actually one recent paper that looks at the longer effects of having women at the local level, women representative level. So that basically uses wireless data to look at the same on education, and it does find that your learning levels are at least higher
Okay.
for children who were born at the time when you had women.
Okay. See, there is hope. Yes. Yeah.
So, I'll take 1 minute to
Yeah.
formulate the question.
Mhm.
So, they include like the differences in complaint proportion of male and female
Yeah.
as a basis. So, this like is there some kind of concentration of references happening? Is like so, do they check for the statistical difference in the complaint between male and female in reserved constituency versus unreserved constituency?
Yeah. So the difference in the complaints is not different across reserved versus unreserved.
Do they make any statistical tests for that?
I think they do. I should check the paper, because they checked that the reserved areas look like the unreserved areas on many, many characteristics, right? Because the reservation was randomly assigned.
But there is a percentage.
Yeah. No, I think they have checked it. I can verify in the paper. Yeah.
And so they are also saying that most of the women contesting the elections are really pure or manipulated.
Mm-hmm.
Now, can you sort of connect this to the first chart that you showed that
Yeah. Hold that thought. Let's talk about it then when we're talking about labor force participation trends, right? Because there's some U-shaped relationship with education as well in India. So it's a non-linear relationship. It's not that more educated women are working more. So
if you just look at the usual trends, just simple observation sort of gives that sort of a feeling.
yeah, and it's there in the data. So there is yeah. Okay, so this is a paper I wrote, which was also on Panchayati Raj, and where the outcome variable we're looking at is different. We're looking at crimes against women, because as we know, this is an issue of quite a lot of concern in India. In a lot of places, women don't feel safe, and we think that's both normatively, it's a basic security of life and property is a thing which should be provided to everyone, and it may also harm economic activity by not allowing people to realize their full economic opportunities. So, we are going to of course use the same Panchayati Raj reform, but we are going to use a different empirical strategy. We are going to, so mainly because we do not have crime data at the village level, so we cannot look at this woman sarpanch versus men sarpanch. We are going to look at the dates where different states implemented Panchayati Raj. There was a lot of variation across states. And of course, by the constitutional amendment, every state had to do this, but they did it at different times for all sorts of reasons. So, some of it was, they had a pre-existing schedule of local government elections. So, they said, well, let's wait for the term of the current panchayat to be over, and then we will do the 1/3 reservation. A couple of states, I think Kerala notably, preempted it. So, the constitutional amendment was in 1993. I think they did their 1/3 women election in 1992, because they said, we know that this constitutional amendment is coming. Right? So, constitutional amendment is a long process. Both the houses of parliament have to approve by 2/3 majority, and then half of the states have to ratify it. So, several months before that it's coming. And so, they knew, and they said, okay, let's we're going to preempt it. That was their choice. And then some states delayed elections. So, either due to budgetary constraints, or Bihar, they had a big court case about reservations to OBCs and so on, which had to be resolved before they could do the election. So, for all sorts of reasons, there was this staggered timing. So, we can thus use a difference in different specification. We can compare each state to itself before and after they implemented this 1/3 quota. So, of course, it's not as clean an identification as the Chattopadhyay and Duflo, which had a very nice randomized rule, but it's at least, reasonable. What we did, so we looked at the, yes?
Like you said, like different states implemented this policy at different times.
Correct.
So, ma'am, there might be some factors which affect implementation of the policy and also crime against
Yes,
women.
yes.
Isn't
That is exactly what I said. It's not as perfect an identification strategy. What we do to control for it, of course, part of it is if there are time invariant factors, that is controlled with state fixed effects, right? So, it's not time invariant factors like, are you a coastal state, are you a southern state, are you an eastern state type of thing. We control for time fixed effects. So, if there are nationwide changes that happen, you had economic reforms and you had all kinds of things. We also put in a bunch of different controls. So, we have control for things like demographic characteristics like urbanization, literacy, women's literacy, what percentage is in farming and stuff like that. We control whether you had a woman CM. We control whether you have the number of police officials you have, total police strength and things like that. So, we try to, the way we are trying to get around is not perfect. We do dump in a whole bunch of controls to think of things like that. And we also put in state specific trends. So, anything which is varying linearly over time for the state is controlled for. Okay? So, it's not perfect, but it's the best we can do. I think at least we have control for most of the obvious things. And the outcome, as I said, we're looking at is crimes against women, which we get from the National Crime Records Bureau. So, this is from the Ministry of Home Affairs. This is, you get this, so this regression we run is at the state level. It tells you how many rapes were reported in this year, how many complaints of domestic violence were reported, how many, etc. So, in different crime categories, it tells you how many FIRs were filed under that category. Okay? That is the data we are using. We add up a whole bunch of crime categories to make this total crimes against women, and then we have separate analysis for rapes and kidnappings against women, because these are the two crime categories which are reported consistently over the whole time of our data. So, our data is from 1985 to 2007 in this paper. And what we find is, after the Panchayati Raj is implemented, we found a 25% increase in the total crimes against women. We found about 12% increase in rapes and a 13% increase in the kidnappings of women. Okay, so we were, I remember the first time we did this regression, we were so dismayed. My co-author said, you have to go check the whole data again. So, I went and checked the entire data again, because I said, I've done something wrong. Right? This is not what I expected. I wanted it to, I thought it would at least result in a decline or at least a zero effect, right? Like, what the heck, this is huge increases. And then we looked at other crime categories like murders and kidnapping of men and boys and crimes against property, and there's no increase in those crime categories. At most, it's a decline. Okay? So it's not like there's a generalized crime wave let loose, which also was a worry because, as you know, the women leaders are less experienced. They may not know how to run things properly, and things go all become worse. That is not the case. Yeah.
Maybe there is an increase in reporting.
Yes.
That's right.
The main bigger.
That's right. So then we said, okay, because once we verified that that data was okay, we said, okay, so what is happening here? It's not a generalized crime wave. Maybe it's an increase in reporting. And the problem is how to document that. So we've had to bring together lots of other different data sources, because this is the official National Crime Records Bureau data. This is only reported crimes. Right? This is the number of FIRs. So you have to file an FIR for it to be counted in this database. Now you can imagine the barriers to filing an FIR for things like rape, or even domestic violence. My in-laws beat me. Many women are not able to come out and file an FIR. And many times you hear anecdotal evidence when they go to file an FIR, the police are unfortunately, they are not very sympathetic, right? So you hear horrendous complaints like, well, so what if your husband beat you? I too beat my wife. Like, yeah, okay, this guy is not really going to help, right? The usual thing, even if parents go to register a case of kidnapping of their daughter, maybe she has run away with her boyfriend.
Yes.
This I have heard. This is very common for the police to respond like that and say, why are you writing a complaint of kidnapping? Your daughter has run away of her own will. So there is a big reporting barrier. So we tried to get some handle on it. So of course we can see that there's probably crimes are very underreported. So for instance, India reports only 2 rapes per 100,000 people, and the US reported about 29 rapes per 100,000 people. So I'm not sure that people in the US are so much worse behaved towards women. I think there's a big reporting issues, because you can see that in things like murder, the gap is not as much between India and the US, and that's the least underreported crime. So it's not that the US is much more violent than India. It's just in certain categories you don't report it. There's further evidence. If we look at the National Family Health Survey, NFHS, 66% of the women who experienced domestic violence said that they had never told anyone about it. So there is a big reporting bias here. So how do we get around that? How do we find out what is going on? Is it really some kind of real increase in crimes against women, or some reporting? We put together different pieces of evidence. So one is we got survey data from Rajasthan, where they asked women, have you been the victim of a crime, right? They asked about different categories of crime. They did not ask about rape, but they asked about any crime. So we find that it's not that women are more likely to be crime victims in places where you have a woman sarpanch. There's basically no difference, but they express a greater willingness to report the crimes to the police when the woman political leaders are present. So they asked them, if something happened to you, would you go to the police? And if you look at the women, there's a big difference. 82% of them would say, I would definitely file an FIR when there is a woman pradhan, compared to a male pradhan. For the men, you see there's a very little difference. There's a slight increase in the number of men who would say they would file an FIR, but it's a very small and not statistically significant. Okay? We did our own survey in Uttar Pradesh. So this was with IGC funding. So thank you, IGC. Where we asked, have you ever tried to meet a police official for any reason? Okay? And again, in the places which had a woman pradhan, the women are significantly more likely to say, yes, I have tried to meet a police person. So they feel more empowered to come forward to the police, particularly when there is a woman pradhan in their village. This is actually again, you see no difference for the men, right? So for the men, it doesn't matter. For the women, it does change their behavior. It's actually very striking, because I will point out that the panchayats have no official jurisdiction over the police. If the policeman does not file an FIR, the panchayat cannot officially do anything about them, because law and order is only under state government, not under local government. So that's why it's actually quite striking to see that even despite that formal channel of power, the behavior changes. Okay? Second thing we tried is we had also a nationwide survey data which asked people who went to the police, how did the police treat you? And again, we find that in places where you had a woman sarpanch, the women who went to the police said they were treated much better. They were not asked to pay a bribe. They actually managed to file an FIR. The police actually investigated the complaint, right? And that you see a big difference between villages with women sarpanch and not. And again, it's quite striking that the police also changes their behavior, not just the victims. And you see that also in the arrest data. So we looked at arrests for crimes against women, and you can find that it increases by 30% after the implementation of Panchayati Raj. And crimes, so if you look at, for instance, this most striking difference, arrests for kidnapping of women and girls and arrests for kidnapping of men and boys, a big difference, right? The men and boys is a small negative coefficient, doesn't change. Arrests for kidnapping of women and girls goes up by 15%. So not only the police is more willing to file an FIR, they take action, right? Well, obviously, that's the first step. This is they're doing the second step, okay? Yeah, arrest can happen only after you file. No? You cannot arrest somebody for a crime which has not been registered. Yeah. This is from the, I'm blanking out about which survey it was, but if you look in the paper, you can see it. So, because we used 3 or 4 different surveys, that's why I'm forgetting which one it was, yeah.
I just meant, is this as a proportion of FIRs filed?
No, this is because obviously if this is just total number of arrests, because number of FIRs has gone up, right? So we want to see whether taking any action. If you divide by number of FIRs, you might get a spurious negative effect, not because they're not being more active, but they're not being active as in proportion.
Yeah, because that itself would be.
Correct. So this is, I think if you do per FIR, it doesn't change, but because the number of FIRs has gone up a lot, that's still good, right? So they're keeping up with that volume of FIRs by actually arresting, okay? So that's what we find. We cannot follow further steps in the judicial process in India because, you know, the judicial process is pretty slow. So if you want to look at whether people were convicted and things like that, that happens so many years in the future that we're not able to actually track it. You know, that would be nice, but it's just hard data-wise. So just think about the policy implications. One is, of course, that the political representation of the disadvantaged groups can increase their access to the criminal justice system. This is not just about providing public goods, but it's providing security, which is a different kind of public good. So again, it also means that these newly elected women are not simply proxies for men. So these kind of results make me very positive about Panchayati Raj. It's not that they're all tokens. Some real change does happen. We had a nice extension where we looked at the SC/ST reservation, because the Panchayati Raj also provided SC/ST reservation at the local level. And what we looked at, we could look at the crimes against SC/ST. And again, we find a significant increase in the number of crimes which are committed under the violation of, what is it now? Prevention of Atrocities Act and the violation of Civil Rights Act, which are very caste-based targeted crimes. We don't find an increase in general SC murders or burglaries or whatever, but these identity crimes, right, the crimes which are committed against you because of your caste, do show a big increase in the number of FIRs. Okay? So it's a very similar pattern to that of the woman. So it's a nice generalization. Where am I? Yeah. The second thing, of course, as I said, the mechanisms of change may not happen through formal channels of power. Right? It's not happening because the woman panchayat leader is now going to fire the policeman if he doesn't, she has no power over him. Okay? So that's quite interesting. We see a change in the behavior of the police, and we see a change in the behavior of the women. So does it encourage women to enter politics themselves? Not sure about Panchayati Raj. We just look at we have a different paper which I'll summarize a little bit later, but it's not that there's a huge demonstration effect that if you elect a small bunch of women leaders now, that will inspire more people later and it'll become a nice virtuous cycle. That doesn't happen. That's very sad. But and as I said, there's a change in the behavior of the police as well. So finally, there are still some open questions. So this quota seems to have some effect, okay? How should we do quotas? So at what level should we do this quota, right? So remember, in India, we have it at village, block, district level, but not at the upper levels. In Indonesia, for instance, they have a quota at the national, state, and district levels, but not at the local level. So different countries do this quite differently. What's the best way? Who knows, right? No, there's no research. In our paper, what we checked is whether it matters if you have a woman Zilla Parishad head. Does it have an additional effect on these crime FIRs for crimes against women? And it does not. So it seems to be more the local level representation that matters. Right? So over and above having all the women at the local level, having a woman district council head doesn't make any difference. So at least for this outcome, that's what seems to be mattering. The second thing is what should be the size of the quota, right? So again, this was a student asked me, should the quota be 33%? Why 33%? I'm like, okay, this is a good question. Why 33%? I think that was what was politically feasible to pass in some sense, right? I mean, what is the justification for 33%? Do we have evidence that it should be 10 versus 33 versus 50? No, we have no evidence. So what should be the size of the quota? Again, we do not know. What I'm doing right now is a supplementary paper, hopefully it will be ready in another 2 or 3 months, where so the data in this previous paper ended in 2007. And what I found is that in the next 10 years, a lot of Indian states have raised the Panchayati Raj quota to 50%. Okay? So I can do a similar difference in difference regression. Again, they did it at different times, nice for me. So again, I can do a similar difference in difference regression about looking at the FIRs, do they change after the 50% quota is passed. And right now, the results so far are a big fat 0. So the 33% quota results in a big increase in the reported crimes against women. Going from 33 to 50% changes nothing. So it's a little, I didn't know what to expect, right? It could be that a certain number of women is enough to ensure these kind of behavioral changes. It could be that reaching 50% is symbolically a very important margin, and so that could have a very large additional effect. But right now, the results so far do not show anything. Third question, we do not know how can elected women representatives be made more effective. Again, big open question. We don't know very much about it. The government has training programs and stuff. For elected women representatives, how effective are they? If anybody knows of research, please tell me. I don't know of good work on this, but this is again, we need to know when we're doing these policies how to actually make them work.
Shouldn't we care about making men representatives better?
Right. It doesn't have to be only women, right? How can how can all elected representatives be made more accountable to citizens?
Because women are performing better in everything.
Yeah, the question is, is it because they've not learned the ways of politics yet? Yeah.
One of the factors which constrain the local governments is the funds.
Correct.
Mostly tied funds which are transferred and they have to implement certain government policies.
Correct.
Probably having more own resources and ability on a tax citizens can make like the system more effective, because then the citizens will demand better services from the politicians, and then that commitment problem can be solved.
That could be one way to make them more accountable, yeah.
The local governments already, they can levy taxes,
But they don't.
do it.
Yeah, the question is, why don't they? They have powers, some limited powers, but maybe they're not even exercising the powers they have. So would they do it if you give them more additional money, or they would just sit back? I mean, we don't know. I mean, in a sense, these are things. There's a huge literature which people should look up if you're interested on decentralization.
Like this quota system, what happens is it's because it's random. If a person is in the office today, he doesn't know whether he'll be in office tomorrow or not. That only kind of creates a reverse incentive.
Correct. So you may not be, you may just be not interested because you have no re-election motivation. Okay. So I want to show you a paper on Brazil where there is a very strong re-election motivation. So hold on and let's see what happens when that happens. Okay.
Ma'am, have you
Yeah.
collected any data where local leader is a woman and the police station, the in charge is also woman, whether the records have increased?
That's a good question. I don't have data because not every village has a police station, right? So it's at, I think every block has one, but yeah. But yeah, no, this is a good question. I do not know. Some states have started this new policy of having women only police stations. The idea is, again, the goal is to improve the reporting issue and enable women victims to come forward. I think some people are working on it. I don't know what the results are yet. I need to check. I think one of my co-authors is working with a different person on this topic.
Is there any evidence of the employability of men versus women in those where women will be represented?
Stay on the? Yeah, no, I don't know if other people know about how employment changes. There is a paper?
They do not find any effect on in manufacturing.
Oh, they do not find any effect. That is very disappointing.
Aspirations that do find that parents' aspirations actually.
Correct. Correct. They have little more aspirations for their children to, for their girls to become politicians. But that comes only after 2 terms of a woman. So if 1 term is not enough, if after you have a woman leader for 10 years, something changes. So maybe 10 years is a magic number, I don't know. Anyway, let me just summarize quickly this paper from Brazil, which is a nice thing to know because Brazil is also a very large, diverse, multi-party democracy like India. So it's nice to see how results compare or not. They do not have a gender quota. Okay. This is also looking at local level elections in Brazil, and they are looking, as I said, they do not rely on quotas for empirical identification, and they're looking at the nice thing about this paper is they're looking at women versus male mayors. So it's also at the similar local level like the India papers, but they're looking at a very important outcome, namely corruption. Right? Several of you have mentioned corruption. They actually, this is their main focus. The nice thing about Brazil is they have very nice data on corruption. So the usual problem with studying corruption is how do you find data? It's illegal. Nobody's going to report it. You know, this is. So the nice thing about Brazil is the central government, the federal government in Brazil did a huge random audit of a whole bunch of municipalities. Now Brazil has something like 5,500 municipalities. They audited something like 1/3 of them. Okay, and because it was from the central government, it was a very objectively done audit. They published the results. They were all publicly released, and they tracked things like they looked at irregularities in government contracts. So did you have any illegal procurement practices? Was there fraud? Was there over invoicing? Was there diversion of funds? And they provide these. It was very publicly announced about the findings they found. So it was a big deal in Brazil. They realized, oh, my mayor has been doing this thing. And there's a number of papers written using this data. And this is one of them. Because of that, as I said, the point is they get an objective measure of corruption, which is measured in the same way across all these provinces, all these municipalities. It's not based on perceptions. So if you look at standard measures of corruption like Transparency International's index, they're all based on perceptions. How corrupt do you think your government is? Now, this is not very objective. This is subjective by definition. So here at least you have a little more objective measure based on audits. So they code any of these violations as corruption. So they have a 1-0 dummy for whether that mayor was found to be corrupt. Then they have other data on Brazil. They have health and education spending. They have hiring of temporary government workers and so on. They even have data on campaign contributions, which is something conspicuous by its absence in India. So no political party in India will tell you anything about funding. So you ask them any question about funding, they'll say, ma'am, we're sorry, we cannot tell you anything. Sure, it's like end of interview. Anyway, so the other thing about Brazil is, of course, elections are free and fair. Voting is compulsory, unlike India, so you don't have to worry about voter turnout and in response to corruption and things like that. So it's a nice place to analyze this question. So the way they do it, they don't have a gender quota. They're going to compare outcomes in municipalities in which a woman narrowly defeated a man to become a mayor to municipalities in which a man narrowly defeated a woman to become mayor. Okay. What's the advantage of this? The advantage is that the idea is that these 2 types of places are similar on many characteristics, because in both there was a man and a woman in the top 2 positions, and the man won or lost by a very narrow margin. So these places are actually similar in terms of voter preferences. So it's not like one place was more pro-women than another place and things like that. Okay? So that's the idea that these places are comparable. This is the standard regression discontinuity design, as we call it. And of course, they check that these places are very similar on things like population, literacy rates, and all sorts of characteristics of these towns. So they do verify that they are indeed similar on a range of different characteristics. Okay? So they are similar in many things, and the only difference is one got a female mayor by a little more votes than the other. So this is a great empirical strategy. The downside, of course, is you have to restrict to a small set of places where a man and a woman were in the top 2, and they won by a very narrow vote margin. So you may have to worry a little bit about external validity, whether this applies to every place in the country and so on. You can see the sample size reductions this happens. So they have about 5,500 municipalities, 2 rounds of elections, 2000, 2004, but only 7% of the sample satisfies this restriction. Okay? But at least within that 7%, the places where women won are comparable to places that men won. They're comparable in all respects except for having a woman mayor. So it's in the absence of a natural experiment like the India randomization, this is at least a good empirical strategy, even if it may not be perfect, but at least it's good. Okay? So this is what they find. So this is for people who have seen regression discontinuity papers before. This is a very standard graph you will see in every regression discontinuity paper. So let me explain what it is. On the x-axis, you have this MV female, which is margin of victory for the female candidate. So they take the vote share of the female candidate minus the vote share of the male candidate. So when that difference is positive, that is above 0, the woman has won. When that difference is negative, the man has won. Okay, so it's a very simple thing. So you can see, it goes from minus 0.4 to plus 0.4. This is the 0 point, right? This is the place which separates the men who won narrowly from the men who lost narrowly. And they are graphing these blue dots are the corruption, the mean of the corruption dummy in these different ranges. Okay? So you can see, so what they're testing then is checking at the 0 point, when you're switching from a male mayor to a female mayor, is there a big jump in the probability of corruption? Right? So this is the area you're comparing. At this discontinuity point, do you see a big jump? So the discontinuity point is where you see the discontinuity in the gender of the mayor. Do you see a jump in your corruption outcome? And in their case, they do, right? So look at this. So you can see that, this is the jump they're estimating. Right? At the discontinuity point, the women mayors are significantly less corrupt than the male mayors. Okay? And the size is large, so the difference is very large. They're saying the probability of observing a corruption episode is around 29 to 35 percentage points lower in municipalities with female mayors. So this is not just like they're a little bit less corrupt, they're much less likely to be corrupt than the men. Okay? Not only they're more likely to be corrupt, they attract about 60% higher federal transfers. So in Brazil, local mayors can lobby a lot for funding from the upper levels of government, not all rule-based. And so they find in the discretionary component that the women mayors get a lot of funding for their areas. They spend it on health at least. They see a 1% decline in premature births, which is good for future life outcomes, and no differences in education provision. So in that sense, it's similar to the India result. They have lower corruption, more money, better health, same education. So at least for the outcomes they're able to track, the women are better on pretty much everything. Okay? And yet, when you're looking at re-election, this is the same regression discontinuity graph, but the outcome on the y-axis is, do you get re-elected? You find that there's a big negative jump here. Men are, about 40% of men get re-elected, only about 30% of women mayors get re-elected. Okay, so despite being better on a whole range of things, they don't get re-elected. This is a graph just showing that do you try for re-election, there's no difference, right? You can see there's no jump at the discontinuity point. So the women try for re-election at the same rate as men, but the men make it, the women don't. So the question, of course, is why? So this is where the re-election incentives play a big role. What do the men do differently, which may be helping them get re-elected? These are the two things they find the men do differently. One is campaign contributions. Women, you can see again, this is the men versus women. There's quite a big gap here. Men get significantly more campaign contributions than women. So they get 30 to 55% less campaign contributions. This is a pretty big gap. Okay? And that, of course, can hurt your re-election chances if you don't have enough funding. The other thing men do, so this is again, look at this big gap for the women versus men. They hire a lot of temporary government workers. So in Brazil, the local governments are allowed to hire temporary workers, short-time contracts and stuff. If they look at the number of permanent permanent workers, permanent government workers, there's no difference between men and women, because that's very rule bound. You have to pass a civil service exam, etc., etc. And so it's very hard for the mayor to change this quickly, and so they find no difference. But in the temporary one, the men hire a lot of temporary workers, and this is in the last year of their tenure. The year before the election, they hire a lot, not in the first year, a lot in the last year. Okay? So, so in that sense, you could say if they are overall hiring more, you could say maybe they're trying to do some big project, and so you can justify it, but this happens in the last year of their tenure. Okay? If they were doing some big project, they should be doing all the hiring at the beginning. No. Last year, they do a lot. They're handing out lots of government jobs, and they're getting a lot of campaign contributions, and they get re-elected. All right, so this is what the story is from Brazil, which was a little depressing. So the question is, what do voters value? Do they not value the lower corruption? Because remember, these corruption audits were publicized. They were all in all the newspapers and everything. Do they not value lack of corruption and more funding from the government? Do they value the temporary jobs more? Or is it that campaign contributions outweigh everything? That's what drives elections? We can think. And again, there's a lot of research left to be done about why do voters vote whatever way they do. We actually know relatively little about what voters drive, what voters value. So people say in surveys all kinds of things, right? So for instance, in India, pretty much every survey in India, you ask voters, would you prefer a candidate with a criminal record to a candidate without one? And of course, they say, we hate people with criminal records or criminal charges against them. Every survey. And you look at the election results, right? So this is what I mean by there's a lot of work to be done on how do voters actually vote. So what they express in surveys does not seem to correlate. And similarly, this is another conundrum you can see, right? You have better performing mayors on many, many dimensions, pretty much any dimension you can name, and they don't get re-elected. So yeah. So as I said, big open area. Anybody wants to work on it, please, because this is something we do need to understand. All right. Yeah.
Everyone hates a leader having criminal record.
Yeah.
But there are few genuine leaders who don't have criminal records. So the choice is too many. I have to vote a criminal record.
Correct, but that's the point, right? Why do parties not take into account the voter preferences? Is it that non-criminal candidates are so hard to find in a country of 1.2 billion people? Please. I mean, we're not a complete nation of criminals. I hope not, right? So given that voters express such strong preferences in surveys, why is there so many criminal candidates still around, and why are they so successful? So I don't know. I'm just saying it's not easily solvable. You're right that it may be that there's not enough supply of non-criminal candidates, but then why not?
Because politics runs around that.
But that's the point. Why do political parties, you would think a political party should be more successful touting non-corruption, right? And Aam Aadmi Party has tried that, but they have not been as successful as you might have thought.
Or as researchers, maybe we are asking wrong questions. We are asking them, IGC chapter and the criminal record a big thing for you, and they would obviously say yes. But we are not asking them how important as compared to religion and caste.
Correct. So maybe we're not, as you say, maybe honestly, that's what I mean. There is a lot of room for good research, because maybe we're asking the wrong questions, right? So that's another way you can improve the research by asking better questions. Yeah.
Could also be that when you survey them,
Mhm.
they will say something. But if you look at actual field or how they are behaving, that's survey behavior and field behavior is different.
Correct. And as I said, we know a lot about survey behavior. We know very little about the field behavior. That's the whole point. There's a big gap.
People are also myopic in view because the last 1 year is mattering the most.
In this case, yeah, exactly. All the hiring is happening in the last 1 year, and they forget what he did in the previous 3 years. They don't care. I got hired just before the election. This is a great person.
Even when an individual decides from his perspective, he will not think as the corruption. He is getting the job that's more important for him.
So the point is, I mean, the decisions are being, so that's, I think, gives an indication of what voters value. It doesn't give a full description, but at least gives some indication.
Short memory power. They can remember only what they have did 6 months before.
Yeah, which is like, shouldn't we as voters become a little more sophisticated? Yeah.
These jobs were temporary, so if
Yeah.
the new person joins in, he can bring in some other people.
Yes,
So that's why they would want the same person to continue.
right, but they're clearly very influenced by that, right? It's very, very influenced by that. Yeah.
When we say that the political parties are not responding to people's preferences, there is a possibility
Correct.
There's a possibility that the moment different kind of candidate got placed, I strategically start shifting with preferences.
That's entirely possible. This is another, I think, big blank area in economics. We usually start with a model people have preferences, and we write down a utility function. Where do preferences come from? Nobody knows. But seriously, we just take it as given, right? So it's not just about political preferences, but in general, we don't know how people form their preferences, right? And how in our models they are fixed. But in real life, are people's preferences so fixed?
When we go for survey and all this, you ask is corruption in things important in sleeping election. You don't give them the large means freedom to say them what they want.
Mm.
When you are surfacing a certain thing, obviously they will give a more bias of that.
That's right. So that's when there may be survey biases, there may be wrong framing of the question, there may be,
More like what
yeah,
means
they may be phrased in a way which is not reflecting the real life trade-off. In real life, they may be asked being a very different trade-off. Who knows? Like maybe we never asked them, do you prefer a job versus non-corruption, right? Maybe we never asked it in that way. So there are all these issues. I'm just saying there's room for many good research to be done here. All right. So let me just finally take some time and talk about what else do quotas change, right? Can they change future dynamics? So is it that, quotas, so one of the things, of course, we would like, as somebody once said, the ideal quota is a temporary quota. That you have a quota for a certain period of time, maybe to overcome some initial barriers, and then say women or whoever else the quota is for are then able to compete on their own merits, and they have overcome whatever, whether it was discrimination or something else. And after a point, you don't need a quota anymore. Right? Ideally, we would like to reach that level. I think we're not there yet. There's sort of glass half full type of evidence on this. So if you look at a follow-up survey with Esther Duflo and her co-authors did in West Bengal, they actually find more women candidates and more women-friendly voter attitudes after 2 rounds of Panchayati Raj reservations for women. So because West Bengal did the randomization, the first time they pulled 1/3 of villages out of the hat, and the next time they again pulled 1/3, and so some villages got 2 in a row reserved. So for those places, you actually find some improvement in women-friendly attitudes, more women candidates, more people expressing greater aspirations towards politics for their daughters, but not in the once reserved places. So whatever is going to happen is going to take a while, right? In this case, 10 years is needed. If you look at, there's a very interesting new paper on looking at Norway's gender quota for corporate boards. So Norway has had a 40% quota for company boards. And they look at this 7 years after, they look at whether women are now more enthusiastic about pursuing a business career, and they find absolutely no change. Okay, so are women going more for MBAs and this like that? Nothing changes. So it's a little bit of a pessimistic result.
After the Companies Act was amended a few years ago, where women have to be on board,
Mm-hmm.
there are companies who are finding it difficult to fill those posts.
Correct. So that is because the existing number of women is so low. Yeah, in Norway also they document that. Apparently the same women sit on multiple boards. So there is sometimes implementation difficulties even in the best of places. Yes. But the sad part is, as I said, the disappointing part has no effect on the next generation of women. So in one sense, if we hope that this will be a temporary situation, this is not very optimistic. So the second thing I will say is, well, in a different paper, we looked whether, well, in a non-quota setting, we looked at Vidhan Sabha elections. We said, suppose a woman wins an election, does it then generate more women candidates? Right? Because you need to have the candidates first. So if you look at this time's Lok Sabha election, 14% women were elected, only 9% of the candidates were women. So actually, if they get in, the women actually doing a bit better than the men, but they're just not there. So we tried to look, how can you get more women candidates? Well, if a woman wins this time, more women are enthusiastic about entering next time. No, does not happen. So in fact, we don't find any increase in new female candidacy after a woman wins a close election against a man. You find a very similar result in the US. So it's not just India. In India, we find something even worse, that in states where gender bias is very deeply entrenched, and we make a proxy measure of this by just the gender ratio, because you know India has a very skewed gender ratio. We say a worse gender ratio means you are more biased. It's a very crude measure, but at least you know it's a reasonable measure. So the sad part is, in the more gender biased states, if a woman wins an election, we actually find a significant decline in the share of new women candidates next time. So it's like one step forward and half a step back or three-quarter step back. So it's the path is really forward is not very easy, is all I will say. Okay, even with quotas or without quotas, these things take a long time to change. So obviously, one of the things is what does hold people back, right? Clearly, quotas are not working fast enough. Just demonstrating success is not enough. Yeah.
And that ratio is only for the Panchayat or for
Which one?
the last point? The women's electoral victory followed by.
This is for Vidhan Sabha elections.
Because there was a recent study which said that actually the backward states, if we take all the 3 levels of government, the backward state has higher women representation than actually the forward.
Yeah, they may have more women in general, but we're looking at if a woman wins, does it just encourage more other women to come forward? And that part, it actually discourages them, which is totally the opposite what you would hope. Right? So it's a little bit sad that you're trying to make progress and it's sort of not happening in a proper linear fashion. Yeah. So then we were trying to do this survey in Uttar Pradesh, which I mentioned before, trying to figure out, okay, what are the barriers facing women? So this is more of a descriptive analysis. So we asked all kinds of questions and we just ran a very simple regression analysis. So we found that, women are much less knowledgeable about how political institutions work, right? So we asked them, about the Panchayati Raj Quota, and a lot of women interpret the 1/3 quota as a ceiling rather than a floor. So when you say, can you have an all-male panchayat? They'll say yes, which is technically not possible, right? Because you have to have some women in there, but they think that only maximum of 1/3 can be women rather than a minimum of 1/3. They're interpreting it completely backwards. Okay, so we ask those questions. We find they are much less knowledgeable than men about how not just quotas but all aspects of the political institutions. We ask them, how good a leader are you? It's on a sort of module of questions. The women assess themselves much more poorly than the men assess themselves. And this kind of leadership confidence gap is found in other countries. In fact, even in the US, you do surveys, you find, do you think you would be a good leader? The women are much more likely to say no than the men. So it's like, the question is, are they really so underconfident? Have they been socialized to be underconfident? Who knows? But you see this very strong relationship. In India, of course, they have a very low voice in key household decisions. So we ask them, how much say do you have in household spending about food or clothes or things? So in food, about 2/3 of them say we have a good amount of say in these decisions. Moment you start going to bigger issues, household repairs, buying land, they have basically almost no voice in those decisions. At least in rural Uttar Pradesh, there's huge mobility restrictions, which we were frankly a bit shocked. 46% of women in our survey report requiring permission to go to nearby places such as a friend's house in the same village. So we're like, they're very constrained lives in that sense. And so when we look at regress the political participation gap on all these factors with education, wealth, religion, caste, etc. So we can explain about 69% of the gender gap in electoral political participation, which includes voting, candidacy, listening to speeches, participating in campaigns, going door to door, blah, blah, blah. It's also interesting, which we were not expecting, if you look at the gender gap in non-electoral participation, not related to elections. So, going to Gram Sabha meetings, approaching the Pradhan, approaching a police official, going to all those kinds of things which are not related to elections. These factors actually explain only 42% of the gap. So there's actually a bigger gap to be explained in the everyday things than in the once in 5-year election things. So one of the things we take away from this as well, some progress can be made by providing good information to women about how things function, improving their self-confidence or education and so on. But I think there's also a potentially large role for demand-side factors, such as social norms, which may dictate how mobile you are or what is the proper role. So some of the things when we talked to women in Uttar Pradesh, we said, are you considering, this is before the Panchayat elections, we said, are you considering becoming a candidate? And one woman said, literally, she said, I don't know, when I was sort of even just thinking about it, I get comments like, kya badi netain banne aayi hai. It's like, for those who don't know Hindi, it's like, what do you think you're going to be a leader now? So, they get this very negative comments. So this is clearly perceived as a negative thing for a woman to be. Right? It's not like, oh, you're thinking of being a leader. No, it was not said in that tone. So it's not like they're told, don't be a leader, but the reaction is so discouraging because it's clearly not seen as the thing for a woman to do. So I think there is some role of that. So I want to show you a little bit of some recent work on the social norms. And this can be only one of many factors. I'm not saying this is the big thing, but there's some new work coming out on how important these are. So obviously there are big questions, do social norms actually affect economic behavior, right? So you want to first know, do they matter at all? The big question we don't know much about is how do social norms get formed, right? Who decides that it is not the thing for a woman to be a leader? How does this thing come and how does it get socially accepted? Why do people subscribe to it? I'll show you one recent paper which I came across quite recently, which is can you change the social norms? And that's a very interesting paper on how they're trying to change some social norms. Okay? So let's see, what social norms is a loose definition. It's not a very precise definition. It's basically some actions, I'm defining it as some actions that people do or don't do in order to maintain their social image. Okay? You're doing it so that you can get approval from others in your social circle. Now, so obviously in some, you can try to model this as a function of beliefs. So think about women's labor force participation. Suppose you believe that women working outside the home will lead to a lot of disapproval by others. That may impose some kind of a psychological cost on you because nobody likes to live with disapproval. It may actually impose a real cost on you if people are not talking nicely to you and you're not cooperating with you in other ventures, etc. So if you care enough about others' opinions, you may not go out to work even if you privately want to do it. You can have a situation where the social costs are just too high. Okay? And so you can, if you want to model it, you can actually write down something like a multiple equilibrium model with two equilibria. One equilibrium in which if enough people believe that others will disapprove, then no woman will work, and then this belief will sort of become self-sustaining. On the other hand, you can write, it can have a different equilibrium where if very few people believe that others will disapprove, then they will not adhere to this norm, and so that norm can change. So you can have multiple equilibria situation. Now, one of these may be more or less suboptimal than the other. You can, in fact, have equilibria in which individuals are sacrificing individual utility maximization to maintain the social image, right? You may privately want to go to work. You may say it will be actually beneficial for my family if I go out to work because with the extra income I can do this, that, and the other. But the social cost is just so much that I forego this potentially beneficial action. The question is, does it happen? And here I will summarize for you a very depressing paper. I was depressed reading this paper. This is a paper called Acting Wife. Okay? And they're actually testing whether women avoid career-enhancing actions because of social image, right? Because these actions signal what they're saying, undesirable traits like ambition to the marriage market. The way they document this is a very interesting way. They had they surveyed married and unmarried female MBA students. Okay? They find that they perform similarly when their performance is unobserved by classmates. Okay? But unmarried women participate less in class discussion when it's public, right? Class discussion is usually public. Okay, that's who knows what's happening. Is it because of signaling? Is it because of something else? So they did a very clever field experiment. They had a career survey, right? Because all this is as MBA students. And remember, these are top MBA students. There's MBA students in Chicago, Booth, and Harvard. Okay? So you can imagine these are some of the very highly qualified, highly ambitious people around. So they asked career surveys about their desired compensation, hours of work, how many days a month you would be willing to travel. And it also asked students to rate their leadership abilities, professional ambition. And this was consequential because if you're not willing to travel for long days or work long hours, usually consulting companies and investment banking companies will not interview you. So your answers on this survey really matter for your placement. Okay? So this is not there's no, in that sense, it's not like you'll want to say whatever the surveyor wants. This is actually consequential for you. The experiment they did was that some students were told that your answers will be discussed in the career class, and some others were told that only anonymized answers will be discussed. Okay, so it's a very simple change in the heading of the survey. And they find a huge difference in how women respond. So they find that in this private treatment, where they're told it's anonymized, single and non-single women report similar preferences. They have a desired compensation of $131,000 a year, which is very high. They want high salaries. They are, they are ambitious. They're willing to travel 14 days a month, work 52 hours a week. Okay. In the public treatment, when they said your answers will be discussed, the single women report $18,000 lower desired compensation, 7 days per month fewer travel, and 4 hours fewer per week. Okay? And there's no difference for the men. Right? For the men, when they said whether it's public, private, doesn't change the responses at all. And here again, it's that the responses change not for the married women, only for the unmarried women. So this is why they call it acting wife. They're trying to signal to potential marriage market partners that we will be at home and take care of the home. We will not travel as much. Okay? And this is very depressing because remember, it's not that child care poses a constraint here. There is no child. Right? So for people who think that child care poses a big constraint to women's labor force participation and career progression, this is a very depressing result because it's not the child. There's no child. It's the norm that men will expect a woman who is not as ambitious and who will not travel as much, and the women are catering to those preferences. Right? Again, they did a separate experiment where they find that the responses change much more when they are discussed in groups which include single men. So they're clearly signaling to the men. Because if there are only married men available, the response doesn't change. Right? Because those guys are already married. So anyway, so the point is,
What are the differences between private treatment and public treatment, even within single and non-single?
That's what I said. Private just told private is anonymized answers will be discussed with the class, and public is your answers will be discussed with the class.
No, about the figures. Those
Yeah.
figures you are reporting about
Yeah.
compensation and those things. How does they differ between private treatment and public?
This is the difference between private and public treatment, right? So in the private treatment, single and non-single women have the same preferences. There's no difference. In the public treatment, the single women lower their desired compensation compared to non-single women.
I am asking about
This is the difference in difference. These estimates are the difference in difference. Private versus public, single versus non-single. Because in the private treatment, there's no difference. Okay? So these are the difference in difference estimates. All right, so I think this is an example showing that the social norms have power. These women are actually foregoing potentially lucrative career opportunities. Because remember, if they express these kind of things in the survey, the consulting company is not going to interview you. They're foregoing this to signal that they will be a better wife, whatever that means. Okay? But that's clearly what they think a better wife means. Yeah. There's no difference for the men. So they have men. Men don't change their behavior. They don't need to signal. That's the sad part. Right? They are not signaling that they will be at home more and they will travel less. Okay, so yeah, it's not a, yeah.
There's another study which is not in the context of men versus women and marriage context, but there's a caste in India. Like there's this experiment was done, I think, I don't remember the paper. Like in a class, students are asked to read out a portion or do sums, and their caste identity was not discussed before they were asked to do the task. So the outcome was recorded, and then the caste identity was discussed, and they were asked to do the same thing. And then the outcome for the lower caste students were much worse than when it was not discussed. So
There's another example, because there's some mental image of how, say, lower castes are supposed to behave. They're not supposed to perform as well as the upper castes. And so when the caste identity is made salient, it's very dismaying, how people are internalizing these norms. Nobody told them do worse on the test, right? See, same here. Nobody said you should reduce your desired compensation. It just said your answers will be discussed. So, yes, it's an example of how social norms matter and how people respond very quickly to even very subtle indications of what the social norm is. Okay? So I'm going to skip this paper in the interest of time. This is a paper in India, but I want to focus on this paper but they actually tried to change the norm. So this is a very interesting new work on Saudi Arabia, which is also, like India, at a very low level of female labor force participation. Okay, so here they say the female labor force participation is 15%. So it's really, really, I think it's 18, maybe it's 18, I think. Okay, point is it's super low. And in Saudi Arabia, actually, women explicitly need their guardian's permission to go out to work. So it's more than a social norm, there is a legal restriction as well. So what they're trying to do is, this is a very interesting experiment because they're trying to change the norm. Okay? So first they surveyed a whole bunch of married men. So they got hold of 500 married men in Saudi Arabia, and they said, should women be allowed to go outside the home to work? And 87% of the men said yes. They agreed strongly with the statement that women should be allowed to work outside the home. But then they were asked to guess how other participants in the session would have responded to the same question. Right? So I ask you in a room, what do you think? And they say, of course women should go out to work. How do you think the rest of the class, what fraction of the class said yes? And they all underestimate how many of the class said yes. Okay? So they all say, they'll say something like, I think only 40% of the people would have agreed with this statement, when actually 87% have agreed. But when you ask them how many agreed, the responses go from something like 0% to maybe 40 to 60%. But 3/4 of the people are underestimating how much other people agree with them. So you see what I mean? This is what I mean by misperceived social norms. They are thinking that the social norm is somewhere where it's not. Okay? So because remember, the social norms are sustained by beliefs. Right? You have to think about what others will think when you do something. And they think that others strongly disapprove of women working outside. So what these researchers did was they said, okay, why don't we tell people the truth? So again, they divided the sample into treatment and control. So half of the people in the treatment group, which was half of the sample, they told the participants what is the true fraction of people who agreed. They said, you thought it was 40%, actually 87% of the people agree that women should work outside the home. So they just told them this information. Okay? And then all the participants were given a choice between, well, now as payment for participating in our experiment, you can either take an online bonus card to buy things online, or you can sign your wife up for a job matching app. Okay? So they sort of provided a belief correction and then saying whether the action changes. And the nice thing is you could look at this treatment versus control. In the control group, about 24% of the men signed their wives up for that app. In the treatment group is 32%. So there is a change in when you change their, tell them what the real norm is, they do change their action. Okay? So it's not like they go 100%, but at least they become much more, they actually forego an online card which they could use to buy things for themselves to sign their wife up for a job matching app, which is pretty nice. And in fact, they also find that this increase is primarily driven by people who underestimated the true share of participants who are supporting female labor force participation. For people who did not underestimate, right? There were some people who were estimating correctly that, yeah, most people would agree with me. They don't change their action, which makes sense, right? It's the people who really were thinking, oh, this social norm is against me. I'll prefer it, but everybody else is going to look at me like this. And then they realize, no, they're not going to look at me like that, and so they changed their actions a lot more. Okay? The nice thing was the researchers followed up 3 to 5 months later, and to see, okay, just signing up for an app is one thing, but then do you do anything further with it? And they found that people in the treatment group, their wives are actually significantly more likely to have applied for a job and interviewed for a job. So they're actually using that app. So they're actually, so it's not like during the interview you say something and do something, but further steps are actually happening in the direction predicted by this. Okay? And more interestingly, those people in the treated group are also more likely to have signed up their wives for driving lessons. So it suggests a more generalized change in the views about women's proper role, or rather what they thought others think is the proper role. It's not that they changed their opinion, they were provided information on how others think. Right? So it was a very interesting experiment about how you can shift social norms. It's not that you've shifted the norm, you've just told people what the norm is, and they were thinking it was completely different. Okay? So that's a nice paper. So it's, of course, you'd have to realize it relies on certain things. obviously, if the true norm was that most people disapproved, this would not happen, right? You can have made things worse. So if it was that people used to think people don't disapprove and then you tell them that people do disapprove, you could have made outcomes go in the opposite direction. So this works in certain types of situations, but it just shows that people do respond not just to norms, but to beliefs about norms. So in a sense, from a theoretical point of view, this is super nice to know that people respond to beliefs. It's usually hard to measure beliefs. All right, so let me just end with a few slides on India's labor force participation for women, which you know is pretty bad. So India has had lots of economic growth. These are numbers from 1990 to 2013. Good GDP growth. Primary school enrollment is now equalized across boys and girls. Total fertility has fallen, right? So if you think about, again, childcare as a potential barrier, well, the number of children per woman has fallen quite dramatically. Urbanization has increased. The services share of GDP has increased. Again, services is usually considered more friendly to women's employment than, say, agriculture, which may require a lot more physical force and so on. And yet, female labor force participation has not picked up. Okay? So this is the blue line from the World Bank's database. You look, it was something like 35% from 1990, and in the recent years, it has actually come down to about 30%. So if anything, there has been a decline. And it's a little bit of a puzzle exactly why this is happening. You know, you would think all of these are obvious things, lack of education, too many children. All those constraints are being relaxed, and yet this thing is not moving. So it's a little bit of a puzzle, and I don't think we have a full answer yet. And that's a problem, because if we want to devise policies, we need to know what the barrier is. We don't know what to, how to frame policies if we don't know what is the reason. So some of these things, some of which I hinted before, if you look at education, these are education categories, primary, less than primary, primary, secondary, etc. You see a U-shaped relationship with women's labor force participation. The least educated and the most educated women are the most likely to participate in the labor market, and in the interim ranges of education, they are less likely to participate in the market. So in one sense, it just means that small increases in women's education is not going to help the overall labor force participation. In fact, it may make it worse. And again, why does this exist? You would think that more educated women will have a better opportunities. And the usual, very standard, simple economic logic does not work. For the men, of course, it's as you expect. More educated men have more labor force participation. That's what you expect. That's normal. And for the women, the curve is totally different. And again, you can note even among the highest educated, this is college-educated women and college-educated men, look at the gap. Right? The gap is just huge. So this is, I think, an urgent policy issue. We do not know, we don't have the answers yet. I hope some of you in this room will be able to find the answers. Here are some more descriptive statistics. These are graphs by caste. Okay? These are female labor force participation. This is by age. Obviously, at the older ages, labor force participation declines. That is normal. That happens for most people. I think the interesting level is the level. So if you look at this highest level, these are the SCs, the scheduled caste women. They are the most likely to work. Okay? Next most likely to work are scheduled tribes. Next is OBC, and then is other Hindus and Muslims. So again, it is, but it's just also known that the upper castes are the ones which are likely to be more educated and have more income. So, and the labor force participation is in the exact opposite direction. So it's not following typical things which you might think. So again, the lack of human capital, so to speak, is not the major constraint, because the more educated ones are, and the ones who have more ability to say, richer households, they have more ability to pay for, say, childcare and stuff like that, and they are the ones least likely to work. Okay, so it's a very different thing. So it may be that social norms are playing a role. Why should there be caste differences which go in the opposite way to education differences? Yeah, the income is also the opposite, right? So the other thing which is actually very suggestive here is the labor force participation by marital status and with presence of children. Okay? So if you look at the bottom two lines, the green is the labor force participation over age for people who are married but do not have children, and the red is for married people with children, and they're basically the same. So again, it's not, childcare is not the constraint here, right? Because married women with and without children have the exact same labor force participation. So, overall lower participation. Doesn't explain this differentiated pattern. Exactly. So for the overall, you could say it's just demand. But again, with the economy growing so fast, you would think demand has grown, right? So it could be reservation, but the point is, if it is social norms, can reservation policies change social norms? I don't know. I mean, I think the jury is still out. We have still work to do on that. So in a sense, it can address it maybe in the short term, but we want a full solution if we have to figure out what exactly is going on. Yes. So I think we don't have the time span to test it, but the point is it's worth looking at these things. Right? So that's all I would say. This is suggestive here. So many open questions still remaining in this field of gender and economics. Some of you are working on this, which I'm very happy to see, and I invite more of you to participate and do more good research. Why do these economic gender gaps persist? What policies can countries adopt to reduce these disparities? Will it also boost aggregate growth? So for instance, if you have a gender quota that reduces corruption, maybe that's actually good for everyone, right? Or, and that may also benefit men. So it doesn't have to come with a redistributive aspect, or maybe it will, but again, we don't know enough, okay? How effective can political gender quotas be? That's the biggest policy measure which is being undertaken by so many governments. How effective are they in reducing the economic disparities? Again, we have to work out. Some of the evidence you cited, you say it doesn't make a difference to employment patterns. And the other thing I think we should think about non-quota alternatives. This is where I think most governments are not paying enough attention. They're all just doing quotas. There should be more thinking and research going into other potential ways to address these disparities. I'll leave you with that message, and I'm happy to take questions, and then we'll have office hours, I think, at 4:30. So see you then. Yeah, I don't find any good basis for choosing it, right? There was no analysis or something. I think it was the biggest number people felt could possibly pass. So the activist groups which are pushing for this, it's a nice number, it's 1/3, so it's I haven't found any. If somebody knows of any, please give me, because I'm also trying to figure out why you choose 33%, because other countries have chosen 10, 15, 20, 40. So
do they have documentation of that, how they have come to that?
No. 33%
Sounds like a good number.
sounds like nice, 1/3, it's a nice round number, easy to convey, it sounds non-threatening. 50% sounds very threatening. I don't know. Yeah.
In this regard, it's probably because 1/3 for women, 1/3 for SC/STs, and 1/3 unwomen. That's probably the only logic.
No, but it's not 1/3 for SC/ST.
Yes.
Yeah, but SC plus ST if you count.
So it's like that. Probably that can be the only logical solution.
Yeah, but then now some places have OBC also.
So it's like,
Yeah.
ma'am, regarding the price, like initially when you talked about measurement issues of what work women do at home, like some work it can be quantified in terms of how much expenditure saving it is, probably, but then like things like child care or care of the elderly person, how does one actually take that into account? But it has a value.
It has a value.
How much time a mother is investing in a child's education? It kind of reaps benefits after a time lag.
Correct.
That's the challenge.
Correct. And right now we're assigning in our GDP accounting, at least we're assigning a big fat value of 0. So I don't know what the right value would be, but 0 for sure is not right. But we are currently doing 0. Part of it is because we don't know what value to assign. That is actually the problem. So we've sort of, yeah, it will. No, it can be misused potentially. Yes. Mm-hmm. Correct. Yes. Mm-hmm. Correct. So some people say it's a simple income and substitution effect. As your income goes up, then leisure is a normal good, and so you consume more leisure instead of going out to work. That can be one argument. I'm sure it's happening. I've cited plenty of my papers. I'm trying to make up that gap. Thank you all.